you very much for the intro. My name's Peter Buckingham from Spectrum Analysis. I've had Spectrum Analysis for over 30 years, and some years ago, Brighton Grammar got us to do a job about 2009, and I guess we plodded along doing a few jobs here and there, and then we got quite serious in it about 2018, 2019, to the point we've done around 70 to 80 schools now across Australia. So it's a big part of our business, and we're very happy to say that. So what I wanted to do today was run through some demographic information and run a presentation that I have done very similar to for Educate Plus a couple of times and some other groups of really just talking about what the demographics are going to do and how it's going to change. And I must say, I also want to take into view that every school here is Catholic school, because it is quite interesting, the Catholic side of things between the primary and the secondary schools, but you'll see that as we move forward. So without any ado, I will bring up my slides, hopefully. Found them a minute ago. Here we go. Okay, hopefully you're seeing a full screen. Someone can just say yes. Yep, I can see a nod. That'll do it. Okay, so I guess the thought for today is, are you feeling there is more or less interest in enrolments at your school? And do you feel the pool of students is changing in your area? And how's this going to affect the long-term strategic planning for your school? Now, I did ask just earlier, and we have at least one or two regional locations. We have Melbourne Metropolitan, I imagine, for most. So we've got quite a bit of variety here, which is really good for us to sort of think about. Now, I'm a bit of a believer that there's a pendulum running at the moment. So what I believe's happened is when COVID hit us in 2020, quite a lot of people started to get a bit more concerned. And I'm going to really spec this as government schools versus non-government, because most of the Catholic schools I deal with are very similar to independent schools. So they really can't draw a line between them, because it's a difference between sort of a school that's charging, say, over $4,000 or $5,000 compared to the government schools that are basically free. Now, all the ones I've dealt with have tended to be either combined right through to year 12, or the secondary schools like Whitefriars and Siena that are obviously year 7 and onwards. So to me, I deal with them very similar and think of them very similar as independent schools. So my view is COVID hit and many people said, gee, the education at government schools not so great. Can we send our daughter or son off to do it a bit better? Sometimes it was, hey, can we get them into year 5 or year 6? They're planning to come in year 7. Or they just move them across. So basically, non-government schools got a really good kick in around 2020, 2021 here in Victoria. And I guess they've had pretty good socio-economics for the last while. And the net effect has been, if anything, if you think of my little pendulum here, I believe it's been on the high side for the non-government schools. Now, times are changing in my view, and it's starting to swing back. Now, what does that mean? Well, to me, it means if you're just going to sit there and say, oh, we've been increasing by 5% a year or 2% a year for the last 10 years, it'll probably keep going. I'm not quite as optimistic for most cases. If I was doing a strategic plan for most schools, everyone's going to be different, but I'd be saying, well, the optimism is we're going to grow a bit further. Probably the midpoint is we're going to stay stable. And without being overly pessimistic, if you're in certain areas, you probably could be dropping. And maybe that's not so bad. Nobody likes to see it happen, but it is definitely happening to some schools. So the 5 things that are affecting the pendulum, in my view, is first, births, number of children and which way that's heading, where they are living, the socio-economics, the appetite of the population to spend on education. It's been pretty good time the last few years, but it is weird at the moment with Donald Trump playing around and causing all sorts of issues around the world. I want to also talk about the single-sex or co-ed schools and talk to you about what's been happening there over the quite long period, especially here in Melbourne. And I'm going to just touch on the religious effects. Probably the Catholic primary schools are more the issue because I imagine most of the schools that are here today are secondary and probably feed off the Catholic primary schools. So let's start with population growth. So you'd all probably remember in 2004, our population had got down, what's called our fertility rate, which is the average number of children a lady between, I think it's 16 and 45 has. Now, you don't have to be a genius to work out. We need to have basically just on 2.02 or so to replace ourselves, to stay level. So that had dropped down to 1.5 across Australia. And Peter Costello did what was called the baby bonus. Now, you might remember that. A lot of flat screen TVs were purchased, they said, but so be it. So anyway, what the baby bonus did was it lifted the fertility rate up to 2.02. So we did actually reach that happy medium point. Now, it peaked in 2008 and was sort of dropped off as a government policy. So the child born in 2008 is now a 17 or 18-year-old, and that's your year 12. So ever since then, the fertility rate has been dropping, and it's now back under 1.5 Australia-wide. So the first thing we've got to take into account is in most cases, we're having less kids to start with. And when you look at this graph, which goes back to the 1920s, what may look like, oh, wow, that was fantastic up here in 1970 and back. Our population in 1970 was half of what it is today, and yet the number of children actually born is not dissimilar. And you can actually see how it's dropped off in the last few years, again, coming down. So the first thing is the fertility rate has dropped. The total number of children is actually dropping. The second thing that makes up Australia for numbers is migration. And that's an interesting issue because I just put these figures for you to look at, and I'll just look at this net overseas migration. So in the ScoMo years of, pre-COVID, we're sort of running at this 240, 250,000. The first year of COVID, we actually went minus 5,000. So 5,000 more people left the country than arrived because they closed the borders. Even in the second COVID year, 9,300 was the net, which is tiny compared to what it had been. We then have been in this makeup area where 437, then 530, and then 329 in 2024. Now, we only have to look at the news, and the government's been on about it. Pauline Hanson's on about it. The Liberal Party's on about it. Where is a happy medium? I guess the interest there is a thing that comes out every few years called the Intergenerational Report. It's signed off by the Treasurer, and it talks about what Australia is going to look like from here out to about 2070. So way beyond where me anyway is going to be seeing. But at the moment, his intergenerational report that came out in 2023 was saying we want to have about 235,000 migrants a year. Now, migrants are normally pretty good for us because they're often young. Often they're here because they've done university and they're wanting to stay on, which makes them pretty smart. And you're often hearing about, who should we have, what sort of migrants we should have in Australia. So the net effect is this number is probably expected to run at this about 230, subject to the politicians, but they obviously got out of control in the just after the COVID. Now, I just want to talk here about saying, well, it's all good to have these forecast numbers, but the government doesn't actually really know where it's going. And these have come out of the ABS. So the high stream, the blue, is, gee, if everything went really, really well, everything was rosy worldwide, we'd end up at about 45 million by about 2070. Probably the lower one that's likely that is there is this bottom one saying, well, things are a bit mushy. The low series is saying we'd end up at about just under 40 wrong, just under 35 million by 2070. And probably the medium is the most likely, and that's saying we'll end up just under 40. Now, they actually said if we don't have any migration, imagine Australia got cut off for whatever reason, then we'd actually be down to back under 25 million by 2071. So the point is the government really doesn't know too much when they're trying to talk this far out. And I guess this is quotes from the ABS website that in 2022, we're 26 million and it's projected between 34.3 and 45.9. So that's a pretty big gap. The current 10-year average had been 1.4% of growth, and they're expecting it to decline to between 0.2 and 0.9. So again, big gap. And I guess the last one is the median age at the time's 38.5. And that's supposed to go out to between 43 and 47 years. So we've all heard about our population is aging, people are living longer, and obviously at the other end of the spectrum, we're having less kids. So it all sort of boils down to that there's probably going to be less children, or it's going to be different over the next umpteen years. Now, I want to just give a little geography lesson. Very simple is when we have a census, we start off with 6 states and 2 territories. Then we break that down here to 107 SA4. Now that stands for Statistical Area 4. That becomes 359 SA3s, 2,400 SA2s, and 61,000 SA1s. So a lot of data is gathered at the SA1 level, but most of the things we deal with come out at Statistical Area 2. So just imagine they're not dissimilar to postcodes. Thing is, out in the regional areas, an SA2 might be big area out around north of Bendigo, out around Boort and areas like that, and yet it's still quite a few postcodes just to try and get up to the average numbers they're looking for. So I just keep that in mind for a minute. So when we start off with these statistical area 4s across Australia, you can see how they look like basically the whole of northern South Australia, the whole of big one out here in Western Victoria, big one out here in Southwest Victoria, etc. And there's about 8 or 9 across Melbourne. What doesn't want to change? So when I look at the ones across Melbourne, this is showing each of the SA4s and what their actual forecasts are likely to be. Now, dark green stands for big growth, through the next green, the lighter green, through this inner eastern one, which is a lighter again, light brown, and then poppy brown. So they're just the way we've broken it down. But as you can see, the 2 big ones I'm going to show you are Melbourne West and Melbourne Southeast. What's interesting when we go a bit further is that this one of Mornington Peninsula is actually the one going to drop the most. Then the one around Brighton and right down through Mentone. The older sort of area out from Ringwood right out through Eltham and that area. I guess your Dandenongs are obviously on the edge of that. And yet these ones on the west and Geelong itself are actually seen to be going to grow. So let's just, I don't know where each of you comes from, but I'm sure you'll have a good idea from what I spoke on then. So basically, the ABS put out data in every 5 years we do a census. We all know that. So there's one coming up in August this year. What we find is they then go through a progression of releasing data. So the actual census will be in August this year. The data we need at that level will probably come out about March next year. So I'll just take you back to 2021. We had a census. It all came out, most of it in 2022. The CEFA data, which I'll talk about in a little bit, is Socio-Economic Index for Areas, came out in 23. And then the population projections actually came out in October 2024. And this is where they broke it down to what they expected to happen from really going back to 2022 out to 2032. So we're already into this phase, whereas when they put them out in October 2019, they actually went out to 2032 at that time. Now, whether they got their fingers burnt, some areas they said were going to grow and didn't, and COVID obviously popped up. Remembering the ones that came out in October 2019, none of us could spell COVID at that point in time. We hadn't heard about it. So they're a bit unlucky. They put out pretty optimistic, things are going to go great. COVID hit almost within a couple of months. So the data we're working on here came out in October 2024, and it's talking the projections out to 2032. So it comes out by age groups, 0 to 4, 5 to 9, etc., etc. And it allows us to say, well, what's going to happen? So according to the best of their projections, Melbourne, when I add all these SA4s together, is going to grow by about 535,000 people. Now, Melbourne's only going to grow by about 26,000 student age, and I'm using student age, 5 to 18-year-olds. Now, when we look at that, of this 26,000, 24,000 are expected in the West, growth. And so I'm talking about Tarneets, Truganina, etc. 11,000 is the southeast. Now, this is the big Clyde, Pakenham, down that area. A bit of smaller growth in the northeast, the northwest, those northern across the top areas. But then you get to the interesting problem at the moment is inner Melbourne is expected to be very stable, hardly change. Inner east, which is where a lot of the big schools are, so I'm talking Hawthorn, Kew, Canterbury, Camberwell, those areas, minus 3,400 students. Inner south, which is the Brighton and down that area, minus 5,200. And outer east, which was that one out towards Eltham, minus 5,600. And Mornington Peninsula, minus 4,500. So you can see the percentages of what's expected to change. Just for your interest, what happened with COVID was obviously a lot of people left Melbourne, probably part of what I was just talking about, but the growth went out into the areas, and it's happened all over Australia, your Bendigos, your Ballarats, your Sunshine Coast, Gold Coast, Newcastle, Wollongong, all these areas, Geelong, obviously, where people suddenly said, hey, I don't have to be 5 days a week into the office. Even if I have to go in 2 days a week, I can deal with it by living in these outer areas of lower price from the actual Melbourne. So Geelong, plus 8.8%, going up 5,000 school-age children. Latrobe Valley, I heard someone from Bendigo, 1,264, 4% increase. So about 10,000 extra people out into the country. Again, your Warrnambool Bulls and your Northwests haven't really picked it up. Maybe they're that further, too far out compared to where people of the Bendigo, Ballarat and Geelong are. And when you just look at this, you actually see the fertility rates in Australia, in Victoria, and you can see the Melbourne, the outer areas are probably the higher, and the really crazy ones are like inner and inner east. Now, obviously, inner east is the main higher socio-economic areas, your Richmonds, your Kews, or the list. Its fertility rate, because, and I'm not here to be socio-economic on this, but obviously, ladies are working longer. By the time if they do move into these areas, they've probably got, 2 jobs. You can just see that what's happening, and obviously they're starting later, but to have families. So you're ending up with this average of 1.05. Okay, so to give you an idea on this, what I've done here is I've actually plotted every Catholic school, which are in our mapping systems. I hope I'll get a chance to show you. We have the data of 9,000 schools already mapped in, what their numbers are, how many students they've got. I'll talk to that in a minute. But when we look at somewhere like Burundara, and this is the statistical area 3, of which there was about 350 across Australia, we can see built into our systems now what the population's expected to be from 2022. Now to 2032 was the government call, And what we've done is we've just extrapolated from 2030 to 2032 and just kept the line running straight. So straight line. So I guess the critical one is this right-hand column. And in Burundara, by 2026, we're expected to have about 30,674 school-age children. And by 2032, according to the government's prediction, it'll be about 27,858. So it's actually going to drop about 3,000 school-age children. Now, some areas like Turak is actually expected to drop about 10% in that period. Again, grandma and grandpa won't move out of the house. By the time someone can afford to buy it, they've probably got to be a principal of a law company, a law firm or something like that. It just gets very hard, and by that stage, their kids are already off their hands. So these sort of high socioeconomic areas are really the ones that are dropping considerably. And Brighton is just as bad, if not worse. And it's interesting out in this Park Orchard, sort of this Warrandyte northeast one, it is probably become a bit of a retirement. People like the style of living. They're not having children so much out that areas. So the opposite to that is if I go and have a look at Whittlesea Wallen, I could have brought up the really big one over in the west, but I thought let's just look at the SA3 out around Whittlesea Wallen, Craigieburn. So it's going to go from around 57, just on 58,000 now, school-age children, to about 66,000 by 2032. So it's going to go up about 8,000 students in this next 6 or 8 years, according to the predictions. So you can see, we can see any area, and not only this is done at statistical area 3, we can then look at it at statistical area 2, the next one down, because that's the one, the like postcode sort of one, because that's the one that the actual data comes out at. And SA2s fit into SA3s, SA3s fit into SA4s. They use the same outer boundaries. The next thing is Socioeconomics Index for Areas, CEFA. Now, I always say to people, if I have to ask a few people how do they calculate the socioeconomics, the normal starting point is average household income. What's the average household income of the area? CEFA is the government's way of taking a few more things into account, like level of unemployment in the area, probably average price of the house, what level of income is being spent paying for either rent or mortgages. It's a way of trying to standardise it Australia-wide. So you have a scale that says, okay, the very, very, very top out here might be Vaucluse in Sydney and Rose Bay and Double Bay, these areas. Now, Mr. and Mrs. Average in Australia live at a score of 1003. This is a bell curve. So one standard deviation to the good side is 1100, 2 standard deviations is 1200. Similarly, 1 standard deviation to the not so good side is the 900, and 2 standard deviations to the 800. So most of Melbourne on average is better than, say, the average of Adelaide, but it's not as good as the average of Sydney. So Melbourne, a really good area, will still be up in this 1100, 1200 area. Turak as a suburb's probably 1150, part of Camberwell, and then your Dandenongs and areas might be in the 850, 900 sort of range. Now, these areas out here are more if we're heading out towards Alice Springs or regional areas out of, out of the capital cities. But it's a way of comparing apples to apples. And we use a scale, dark blue, light blue, whitish, light brown, brown. So when we look at Melbourne, I've put on this, the CEFA areas, and also every one of these dots is a Catholic school, according to ACARA data. So you don't have to be smart to work out that the highest 20% across Australia is probably this line, the dark blue. Now, it does get some funny little exceptions in places. You go, why is that? Maybe around Carlton because of university students. maybe flats in Richmond or something, housing commission, something can pull it down a little bit. But in general, this is the top 20%. Then the light blue is the next 20%, the white is the next, light brown, and then the dark brown. So all of you would know where your school is, and you'll get a fair idea of where it sort of stands. Now, this is one way of sort of saying what is the potential fees that the parents are likely to be able to pay. Obviously, the group in here is the Kew Hawthorn group, which is probably the highest density of independent schools, which includes ones like from the Catholic system, your Genazanos, Xavier's, and St Kevin's, and then you get them all over the rest of Melbourne. So I wanted to just have a little talk here about what has happened according to the numbers for Australia first, and then we'll have a look at Victoria. So if I start at the bottom, across this period from 2021 to 2025, total number of students rose 3.39% across Australia. Now, I'll start with government. Government actually dropped 0.26%. Catholic education went up 6.17%, and independent schools went up 14.9%. Now, it's a funny situation between independent and Catholic in that some Catholic schools are represented in ACARA as independent. I deal with Loretto's. Sydney, I think the Loretto's are showing as Catholic, and in Victoria, the Loretto's are showing as independent. Now, they say it's different levels of governance and things like that, but to me, I would have imagined they were all one group. And I think even EREA is showing different in one state to another, which amazes me a little. So it's not a perfect thing. But let's just take what I also look out of this is Catholic primary is dropped, Catholic secondary is high, and combined is, again, the schools that go K to 12. So the Catholic primaries are probably the issue at the moment in a lot of places. Now, government schools, they're down in the primaries, hanging in with their high school, or hanging down in with their secondaries. And again, the numbers are much less in the selective government schools that are only 7 to 12. And in independent, they're the ones that have gone up most, probably partly that COVID issue, where the combined schools, the big schools, are able to pick up because people wanted to move their children mainly out of the primary schools. When I look at Victoria, similar picture, but a little bit different. So total percentage is up 5.5. Catholic up 3.8 in your combines, up 6.24 in your secondaries, and still a slight rise of 1.2 in the primary school Catholic. Government, you can see, and independent obviously went up pretty much. As I said, independent primary is very few schools, for example, and even independent secondary is not that many because they're mainly combined K to 12s. So to give you an idea, and this is where I think a lot of, and I deal with quite a few Catholic schools, one of the first things I normally say is, who are your feeder schools and what are they doing? Now, this is just an example. In our mapping, which hopefully I'll get to show you for a small time, you can see here that this is a school in East Doncaster. Well, back in 2008, had 191, got to 218. It's now down to 60. Now, somewhere soon, I imagine that is no longer going to be in existence. Now, the problem is what happens after that? And I guess it comes down to a lot of drop is happening in people wanting to send their children to Catholic primary schools at the moment in a lot of these developed areas. On the other hand, I looked at another one, which is out at Wollert. It only opened in 2019. It's gone from 105 to 559 in literally, 7 years. So I guess Max and others and that group have a lot of work to do, and they're doing it. I understand that. But when you're an established school, if the schools around you are dropping off, the Catholic schools that you're expected to get as feeders, then it's going to hurt. And as I said, we deal with quite a few of the schools already. Now, I want to just bring on the single sex versus co-ed issue that's coming out quite a bit. Now, I'm obviously in Victoria, Melbourne. And the interesting thing, and I'm going to show some more numbers, but Melbourne in 2010, if I go at the ACARA data, had 4.7% as pure boys' schools, 8% as pure girls' schools, and 87.3% as co-ed. Now look at that compared to New South Wales. And to be honest, Victoria's already done their big changes. Some of you I'll talk about in a minute. New South Wales, it's starting to happen. So if I'm looking at New South Wales, and I now go and look at 2024, Victoria's, the boys' schools has gone from 4.7 to 3.9 from 2010. The girls' schools have only gone from 8% to 7.8, and the independents have grown to 88.3. Now in Sydney, again, from 82.9 to 86.7, but they're still very strong in boys' schools and still quite strong in girls' schools compared to, say, what's happened here in Victoria. Now, when I went to school back in the last century, there are actually 20 APS and AGS schools, all exclusively boys' schools. Now, 12 of these have now gone co-ed, and you'll know them: Carey, Penley, Wesley, Caulfield, Ivanhoe, Yarra Valley, College, Grammar, Geelong, Assumption. You can see them all. And it actually started in Victoria back with Geelong Grammar in 72 and College in 75. So I guess the really interesting thing there is Melbourne, this has been happening over many, many years, to the point we only now have 8 all-boys schools. And then probably a couple of those are Catholic. In fact, 3 of them are basically Catholic, and the other 5 are just independent. But the pressure is happening now in Sydney, because Sydney, the first couple of schools are changing, or it's really moving on right now, with both Newington and Cranbrook going co-ed this year. So what we've seen, and the pressure it puts on the all-girls schools, has been happening here over a long time, but it's starting to hit Sydney. So what does that pressure look like on the all-girls schools? Is you only have to think about schools like Mentone Grammar and Mentone Girls Grammar. The Mentone Grammar goes co-ed. You start asking yourself, do I want to have my children at 2 different schools? Mentone Grammar are probably offering all sorts of discounts to try and get girls to come to their school, and poor old Mentone Girls Grammar that's sitting right beside it is getting whacked. I don't think you have to be a genius to know Genazzano's got down. You only have to look it up. It's all public knowledge on the ACARA data. But what I want to just touch here is, if I start from my 1970 and 8 boys' schools now, and I look at co-eds, the co-eds, if I look at 2008, there was 10,000 boys in the 8 schools. There's now 11,000. They've grown 7.1%. And actually quite a bit of that happened over COVID, because once the government here put in its payroll tax, a couple of the schools actually did some things to take in a few more students. Trinity, Camberwell, they've taken in a few more students. They were quite happy where they were, but needed to probably help the balance sheet. When I look at the co-ed schools, this is interesting. 9,175 in those 8 schools. And by 2024 it was 13,448. So it was up 46%. So you can see where the pressure's coming on, whereas the boys went from 14 to 15, up 8.4%, yet the total score went up 23. So it's no secret to see that the big pressure's been on the girls getting dragged into the co-ed schools, and the co-ed schools have been straight up front going for it, with scholarships and special deals and whatever you want to talk about. I did this slide, actually made this slide today because I was just interested myself, where if I look at 2008, So the schools, that group of 12 co-ed schools were at about 39% and 61% in 2008. They're now at 46 and 53%. There's still more boys, but the girls has been coming up. And when I look at it going this way, if I go from 9,000, the girls are actually up 46%. The boys are only up 8.4%, which is comparable to what's happened with the boys' schools. And yet the co-ed schools are up 23.2%. So I guess you can really feel the pressure if you are the all-girls school when this is what's happening, getting hit by these really big, powerful boys' schools. Co-ed schools now. I just wanted to go on one other school that I've thought's been interesting. Number one, my wife went there, so I've known of it for many years. Kilvington, which is a client of ours, and this is public data, so I'm not telling anyone any secrets, they had dropped down to about 385 in 2011, about 380 in 2010, and they went co-ed in 2011. They've now got back up to 758. And they're actually equal number this year, last year, the 2025 ACARA data, at 379 boys and 379 girls, which is really interesting when you think they had 385 girls back in 2011. Now co-ed and very, financially much more stable. They're obviously in a bit of problems here. But that's about the only case I sort of know of where a school has gone co-ed from being an all-girls school to become a co-ed. I think people have told me St Michael's might have done it way beforehand. But if you look at that compared to the big boys' schools, when they've gone co-ed, they've then gone and opened extra campuses. Haileybury's got more than you can poke a stick at. You only have to think of Wesley, Caulfield, Ivanhoe. They've all got multiple campuses and they've expanded. Whereas the Kilvington's a good example of just purely going co-ed, same place, still on the same block of land, just a lot more packed in. You can see how they've been stable now for the last few years. They're not looking to, their jump really kicked in back here. So looking into the future, I guess what I find, it's interesting to see if independent schools will keep growing. I think the pendulum is swinging back. And when I call independent and Catholic secondary schools, I'll call into the same thing. Some of the independent anyway, especially the boys' schools, are starting to say they're full. I think a few of the co-ed ones are still saying, well, we're full, but if we can get any more girls, we'll happily grab them. I always ask myself, with this government doing their Better and Fairer Schools agreement, is that likely to have an effect? We've all heard they keep talking about throwing a couple of billion around. Maybe some schools are going to get, government schools are going to get some more money, and that might make it again a bit more in their favour. I keep wondering here in Victoria, it was really interesting when the payroll tax came on. My memory was it was going to be at about 8,000. I think the state government worked out they would have been looking at what the votes were going to be at that. Next thing they lifted it up to, I think the number was about 14,000. And I think that probably their view was the parents that are paying at least 14,000 probably weren't going to vote Labor anyway, so it didn't worry them too much. And they set that line, which some of you may be hit with. And the other thing is, if the economy is declining, will this cause a move back to lower fee schools? I'm not the one to be able to say that exactly, but I think it probably will. So I guess, which way is the pendulum moving? With low fertility rates and things, I believe it's heading back. Many schools will need to reach out further if they're going to maintain their status quo. We did a little exercise on Burundara, the SA2 of Burundara, and it worked out, sorry, I'll say that, I think it was the SA3 of Burundara. It worked out that there is about 16,000 places in independent schools. There's about 13,000 students that go to independent schools in Burundara, which means about 4,000 to 5,000 have to come in from further out of Burundara, let alone those ones that live in Burundara and go out, because if you went to Melbourne Grammar or you'd be leaving Burundara. So it's probably a number near 5 or 6,000 minimum of kids coming into Burundara every day. Now, it sort of means it's not easy for them to pick up more. They've got to keep going further out if they want to keep their numbers, or if they're even thinking of increasing. So some areas are going to be like that. Other areas, obviously, if you're out in the western suburbs or the northwest, it's just numbers coming at you. So I believe that in scenario planning, depending where you are, you've probably got to be saying, and if you are in that inner Burundara thing, you've probably got to be pretty much saying our aim for the next few years is probably to be stable rather than dropping. And I guess their backlash part of that is COVID was probably fairly good for the regional schools because it did actually change the way people thought, especially in your Bendigos, Ballarats and Geelongs, where younger people moved out. It wasn't quite expected, but now you're getting the benefit of all of that type of things happening. Okay, so I'm happy to throw it open to any questions, see what people's thoughts are, if anyone has any questions for us. Must have done a good job if no one's got any questions. Well,
if you've got a question, I was going to say, if you've got a question, happy for you to flick your mic on and talk the question out loud if you needed to. No? All good.
Okay. Well, look, we have done a white paper which we've given to David. I've also happy to make these slides available if you would, if you would like them, or I'm happy to send them around. You just tell me where you want them to go. And if anybody wishes to have a chat with us at any stage, just Google spectrum analysis and you'll find us pretty quickly. But we'd love the opportunity to chat. The other thing I didn't have time to show you today is we have a full mapping setup. It's online. It's called GeoMapping Plus. There is a free startup where you can see every school in Australia, how many students they've got, various information. Also, some 17,000 early learning centres are all what's called the ASEQA data. And then as you come on at different levels, you can see lots of different things, including all the population projections and things of that nature. So when we do a school for a full project, we then set up the online mapping so they can see their own students, their future students, their alumni, each area by what the population forecasts are for the next 10 years. It's all set up there in a mapping system called GeoMapping Plus.
Yeah.
Okay.
Pete, just quickly, I can see that Sue Elson's put in a question. What do you think the best strategy is for schools going forward?
Okay, so again, my big thing is I believe schools should have most schools have a 3-year plan, a strategic plan, and I'm over this sort of hearing we're going to do a bit more religious education and we're going to cut out bullying. I've heard all that before. I think in their strategic plan, schools should be putting some sort of numbers along. This is what we expect to do. These are our targets, statistical numbers. And I would think that depending where you're located, you need to be realistic. And if you are located in a Burundara type area, you need to be realistic and say, well, look, there's the medium line, the hold line, and maybe the drop line, and maybe a growth line. But don't be sort of sitting there with your head in the sand saying, oh, look, we're starting to drop, but it's going to change overnight. Because a lot of schools, and you only have to look at the likes of a Genazzano, they've gone from, I think it's 1,100 to 700. This is public Akara data over the last around 8 or 10 years. So, it hasn't turned, and there are a few others like them, and we've dealt with quite a few of them. And if they need some help, or we're the ones to try and help, at least talk reality rather than head in the sand hoping things are going to change. So my biggest thing for schools is if you do have a plan, try and be realistic about where you're going to go, because as I work a lot with John Somerset of Somerset Education, who's the absolute guru of benchmarking